Yes, I am. It was my first day back in the office, actually. So, yeah, it's been pretty busy.
We're glad to have you. Can you give us some context into you and the work that you do there?
I'm the head of corporate affairs at Synthesia. I've been here for a year and a half, just over a year and a half, and I essentially cover all things comms and policy. I've been working in tech for 15 years now. Synthesia is by far the smallest company that I work for, if you like, in terms of number of people, but it's probably one of the most exciting for sure.
The work you do in policy specifically, how does that work?
Well, I guess you can sort of think of it as an extension of comms and vice versa. Policy is an extension of comms and comms an extension of policy. Essentially, a lot of the work that I do is either educating policymakers about the latest developments in artificial intelligence or learning about new regulation that they're thinking of bringing about and explaining some of the impact that that regulation could have, especially on startups. A lot of times, people in government spend time talking to large tech companies. Large tech companies tend to have, in some cases, hundreds of people working in their policy teams. They tend to have not a lot of time with startups, and sometimes the regulation that they kind of adopt isn't always beneficial to startups.
hmm And the EU AI Act is an example of this, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting example of a situation where I think the intention was to kind of start from a good place. But then I guess as different companies had different priorities, as different member states of the EU had different priorities, it became this kind of Christmas tree where everyone would kind of hang their decoration on it. And in the end, I think it became a pretty complex and in parts unwieldy piece of legislation that seems to make everyone unhappy. But also at the same time, the kind of implementation of that piece of legislation has been quite rocky. We've had situations where some of the kind of finer details, like the code of practice, which kind of gives you some practical advice on how to be compliant with the EUA Act, came at kind of very last minute. And there were some other kind of details in the legislation that weren't perhaps useful to European startups.
Can we touch on those concerns for European startups a little bit? When you were looking at the policy and you were climbing through this, combing through this very large document, I assume, what really stood out that you thought, actually, this is not beneficial for the European ecosystem?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting provisions in the EUA Act is that as a startup, you can take an existing model. So you can take like an open weights model like Llama, and then you can fine tune it to fit your specific needs. Like let's say you're a healthcare startup that wants to use AI to build a better product.
hmm
And you take the Llama model. A Llama model is a general purpose model. It can be used for any sort of applications, but you want to fine tune it. You want to improve it specifically for your healthcare app. Well, depending on how you fine tune that model and the amount of compute that you use to fine tune that model, all of a sudden you as a startup can become responsible for the entire model, and you become essentially what's called in the UAI Act as the model provider. And so you inherit all of the provider obligations. So you have to develop the documentation, you have to provide the training data summary, the copyright policy for those modifications. And I think even though obviously again this maybe came from this traditional way of, in software, there's a saying, if you touch it, you own it. That could work well, I guess, for traditional software, but with AI, there's a very interesting paper from Apple that was published just a few days ago, where they call something they call it the super weights paradigm, where if you change some specific weights in a model, it can impact the performance of the entire model. And I think this type of sort of responsibility on a small startup can be actually quite difficult to manage. unlike the larger companies who have the infrastructure and the teams to kind of take on that responsibility, for a startup, this actually can be quite difficult. And so I guess my concern was around the fact that you seem to be creating all of this legislative sort of requirements, but companies in the US or China, they're moving at, you know, three, four times the speed because they don't have to deal with some of these complexities. And so you're kind of slowing down European startups from innovating, and that could have a, you know, a negative effect.
The rhetoric that I've heard is like the EU AI Act is supposed to slow or supposed to be traffic stops along the AI highway that, you know, obviously is just taking effect or taking us all for the ride at this moment in time. When you look at the work that you do at Synthesia as an example, you've got some incredible technology and some incredible features. Does that directly impact the work that you do? Or is it something that currently doesn't fall into the work that you do?
At the moment, it doesn't. One of the key provisions in the EUAI Act is that you have to be classified as a general purpose AI model provider. Your model needs to pass a certain compute threshold, and also your model needs to be general purpose.
Hmm.
And we build very specific models. In our case, we build models that allow people to clone themselves, so clone their voice and their likeness. Those are very specific purpose models that don't fall under the kind of general purpose definition.
Do you look at it though
However,
and think that, okay, this is just an opening for them to potentially push more legislation that would affect you?
I don't know about that. I think what, like I said, what the kind of bigger picture, if you like, is that there are so one, there's the kind of this definition of general purpose models. The other is this approach to what they classify as high risk.
Hmm.
And just to give you an example, like I'm from Romania. So when I was a little kid, I was studying English. My parents were not a very wealthy family, and so we couldn't afford tutors. The English that we were taught at school was almost non-existent. And so my parents actually had to save up a lot of money to, and you know, a call on a family friend to give me some English lessons to kind of get me started. And one of the big potentials for AI is in education. And in fact, a lot of these conversational chatbots, they're really good at practicing language. Like if you want to
Really
learn.
great. Like I've been using it to learn Spanish and French. It's unreal.
Exactly, exactly. And so I'm thinking about like kids like me who are now in Romania or other countries in Europe and they want to practice their English or any other language. And education is classified as a high risk under the EUAI Act. And I just struggle to see how building a chatbot for you know, teaching someone another language can be high risk. Like, I mean, I understand, of course, you're building for, in this case, for children, and there are certain things you have to consider. But I just don't see that as at the same level of risk as like a, you know, biochemical weapon, let's say.
Yeah, it's a weird space right now. Like I'm with you on the fact that the risk element sort of feels a little bit convoluted. It's like, what are we classifying as risky here? Of course, the model is essentially taken the entirety of the internet and human knowledge and sort of allow you to access all of that. But I assume it has restrictions built into it. We haven't had a chance to talk to the OpenAI or Claude teams as an example yet, or Gemini teams as an example yet. But you would think that those restrictions are in place where if you try to do that or try to build those sort of weapons, so to speak, that it would stop you or it just wouldn't answer those questions, right? They're constantly adding that into the newer models and prevent you from doing harm. What I'd love to understand is when we think about just policy in general, they're typically written by people who haven't built startups before. How do you go about educating someone that's a policymaker that hasn't built or hasn't worked with technology and help them understand what artificial intelligence is?
Yeah, there's actually a great book about this that I started reading, but I haven't sort of finished on the plane. Um, and it's written by this author. I can't remember his name right now, but essentially he is Chinese American, and so he spent time both in China and in the U.S.
Okay.
He draws this parallel between the Chinese government and the American government. So he says, If you look at the Chinese Communist Party, their kind of higher echelon, almost everyone there is an engineer. So they all have
Hmm.
engineering degrees. So the people who run China are by the majority of them are engineers. If you look at the American government, the last sort of several generations of presidents and vice presidents, with some obviously notable exceptions, they all are lawyers. And so he kind of makes this argument that everything in China is about engineering. It's about building. It's about even the he talks about social engineering. Their COVID policy and the kind of one child policy. Whereas everything in the US is very much in terms of kind of building everything in the kind of legal system. And he was doing this interview recently about the UK, and he said the UK is actually worse than the US because in the US, the all the presidents and vice presidents are lawyers, but in the UK, they're all Oxford graduates, and and basically the idea is that a lot of times these people, go to school and learn about some of the theoretical principles. They study PP at Oxford, politics and economy, and they've never had the experience in the sort of real world of like building a business or running a business. And I'm not saying that they should, but I think that sometimes they don't have the intellectual curiosity to learn about what it's like to run a business or build a business. And as a result, some of the regulation that they kind of put forward, they don't necessarily think about if economic growth, like we have in the UK, is a goal. You need to sort of understand the consequences of your regulation in terms of how it affects economic growth.
That definitely seems like logic. We want engineers, we want people that have built those things and built that technology, making decisions on that technology, not just people that haven't studied it and just understand the social context. I think more and more we find ourselves in that position. It feels like a readjustment of the world, or at least what the US is trying to do, and get all of these businesses into government and try and help them write their policies. It feels like that's what the White House is doing. I don't want to comment because I'm sure they'll come after us over here. Look, to change gears slightly, we had this great conversation around comms and corporate affairs and how that typically for startups, it's bundled into marketing, right? And actually, they should own their narrative more. And that's the work you do at Synthesia. Can we touch on this a little bit? It was one of the most insightful conversations that we've had or I've had off stream, and sort of opened my mind into the fact that actually you should be controlling your narrative more, not letting a PR company do that for you.
Yeah, I think a lot of startups, especially when they're at the very beginning of their journey, they want to get their story out there, and a lot of times they'll hire like a general purpose marketing person. They have, 1,000 things on their plate, growth being probably the most important of them, and comms usually, and policies as well, are an afterthought. So a lot of times what they'll do is they'll hire a PR agency and say, here are my key messages, here's kind of my product roadmap, help me get in TechCrunch, or it used to be the case, help me get into TechCrunch.
Now it's come on ventures.
Exactly. Now it's more to your point, like, get me on the podcasts and the newsletters, which is fine when you're kind of starting up. But as you grow, as you reach product market fit, and you have the kind of resources, financial resources and kind of human resources to hire, I think a lot of startups think that they can just replicate this kind of arrangement long term. And what they find very often is that those PR agencies, a lot of times they're equipped to help you when you're at the sort of pre-product stage, but they're not set up to take you into, as you kind of mature as a company. And as a result, usually mistakes are made. I don't think, voluntarily. I think a lot of times it's just, I don't think there's any kind of bad faith. I think it's just the nature of how things go. And um, and then it's very hard once you've got some negative coverage, it's very hard to kind of shake that off and kind of move on. So I guess my recommendation has been once you reach a certain stage, it's probably best to invest early in kind of bringing someone in-house because the return on that investment in the long term is definitely going to be something that you'll experience.
What's your take on the whole all press is good press?
I don't think that's true. So I think the I tend to favor quality over quantity for a number of reasons. First of all, if you're a lot of times, startups grow through word of mouth, and word of
Mm.
mouth is reliant partly on SEO. And so if, Google sort of detects that you're trying to quote unquote sort of game their system, you might find it hard to recover from that. Whereas if you actually get good quality press coverage, Google will definitely favor that. They favor, high quality recent content. So I think it helps you with a bit with growth, but not necessarily in terms of like awareness and kind of brand building. It also helps you to focus on quality to build relationships, like long-term relationships, which can be very, very beneficial, especially as you grow as a business and want to, continue that kind of momentum. And I think the other thing about the sort of spray and pray approach is you don't focus. So it's actually very good to be able to focus and sit down and think, what are the kind of key messages that I'm trying to land, and what's the kind of vision for, the kind of next couple of years. If you're constantly kind of spamming people, you don't have a lot of time for reflection, I think.
The reflection's key, right? You want to be able to win share of mind in a great way, not be the constant like a butt at the end of a joke, as an example, right? You don't want to be the meme today, more than anything. Although it sort of feels like everything's moving so fast, you just end up getting like out of share of mind, and then something else takes on. You mentioned that it's probably a good idea to invest in a team or a person that starts to build out this corporate affairs team, starts to build out this narrative. What does that person look like? What do they end up doing?
So another element that I see with startups, that I understand why sometimes that's needed, but it might not be in the long term a good approach, is they'll typically kind of put the comms team under marketing.
Mm.
For a long time, that made sense. If you go back, 10, 20 years ago, it made sense potentially for comms to be under marketing because comms was seen as an extension of growth. Getting press coverage was one of the only ways for you as a company to sort of be out there. Today, that no longer is true.
You've got
Influencer
LLMs, right? Influencer marketing as an example.
Yeah, yeah. So those kind of channels definitely should be owned by marketing, and they do an amazing job at it. Whereas comms has morphed into more of a, corporate affairs, where it's all about brand reputation, building up the profile of your executive bench, ensuring that, your kind of reputation is intact, you have the license to operate. So as a consequence, comms has sort of moved away from marketing and closer to legal, and working more closely with those kinds of stakeholders. And so I think if you're looking to hire someone in comms, try to look for someone with that kind of background in more in the kind of corporate affairs, global affairs arena, as opposed to the kind of, run-of-the-mill marketing comms people. And I think that's a smarter approach for the long term, for sure.
Did you end up being a fixer, like this individual that goes around putting out fires a lot of the time, or is the work a lot more focused on crafting that narrative? Talk about building up the profile of your executive team, making sure that they're seen as a quote unquote thought leaders, talking to the right people, talking to the policymakers, making sure they stand out in the world of slop that we exist in today.
Yeah, I think it's all of that for
Yeah.
sure. Um, Obviously, I've worked on projects where I think the reputational risk was high, and I had to ensure that there wasn't sort of reputational damage to the company. But I've also worked in exactly what you're describing, like working closely with the C-level team, working closely with marketing to make sure that sort of we build that kind of narrative and thought leadership. So it actually requires you to have a lot of skills. It's not kind of a very traditional role.
What do you lean on the most in that skill set that you've built up? I mean, like you worked at Arm at a young age and then Meta for a considerable period of time as an example. What is a skill that you've picked up that sort of sticks with you and is the not the silver bullet, so to speak, but the one that you lean on the most?
I don't know if it will sound revolutionary or not, but common sense. Having common sense is actually a really good skill to have. I remember, I can't name exactly the company, but this was a previous company that I worked for, and it was my first week. And a few engineers were doing a presentation at a big conference, and they sent me the slides to review. And in the slides, they had these monkeys that were snorting they were snorting something, and what they were snorting was data. And so the idea was like the monkeys are snorting the data. And I was confused, and I sent a message back saying like, this like, did you forget to remove this slide? I mean, I get the joke, but this is one of the biggest tech conferences. And the engineers were looking at me like going like, well, this is funny, right? And I was like, well, okay, this is funny as an internal joke, but maybe not as funny if you're one of the largest tech companies in the world and you're doing a meme on, monkeys snorting people's data, probably not the best thing to to have in your slides. So, I mean, that's just one example, but common sense actually takes you a long way, I think.
I can imagine. It sort of feels like yourself and your CEO are speaking from the same script. I was watching the Bloomberg interview. I think it came out 2 days ago or yesterday, and he says that problem solving and along the same thread, I assume common sense are incredibly important today more than ever. Like AI can only do so much, and like it's you that has to prompt it. It's not going to prompt you, as an example. I'd love to get your take on the companies like Cluely or that are today just driving attention towards the product as a way to find product market fit, win users into the product. Obviously, they want to get to a certain MRR and ARR. Do you think that that sort of hype attention is right for these early stage companies?
I mean, that's definitely something that a lot of the American startups are highly engaged in. I would
Mm.
I think it's definitely a case of fake it till you make it. I mean, literally in the case of Cluely, it's fake it till you make it. But I think the challenge with that approach is you're not building a long-term sustainable relationship with your customer base. And a lot of times you'll hear all of these founders, they'll go on X and they're kind of wax poetically about how they replaced their entire teams with AI. Like, oh, I've replaced my entire sales team with AI. I've replaced my entire engineering team with AI. I get the desire to do that to some extent for the clicks. However, there's actually something special about having human relationships in general, not just at work, but in life. And so the idea that, as a user of your product, I'm forever going to be talking to some AI chatbot that may or may not help me doesn't build, at the moment at least, doesn't build the kind of confidence in your product and in your company. And having that kind of human touch, even, let's say I've used your AI-based agent for your contact center, but after a while, if I don't get what I need, I actually need to talk to someone. Like if I'm paying a certain amount of money every month, I would like to talk to your manager, basically. And so I think there's kind of actually valuable of maintaining some level of human connection. Of course, you should automate with AI if you can, but having that human touch, I still think it's important.
Hey, I'm big fans of the work that you guys are doing at Synthesia and the blend of humanity and technology that you're putting together. Boy, it's a lot of fun. Talk to a lot of the team. And so hopefully we can get you back on again to talk more about policy and the work that you do. Alexandru, this has been amazing. Thanks for the time. I'm going to let you go back to crafting the narrative and putting out fires.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been fun talking to you.
Let's do it. Let's do it again soon. Thanks so much.
Bye. Bye.